All right, we'll bring up a question from Mary, who says, a few shows ago, you mentioned that you hadn't heard anything from the pulpit about the transgender epidemic. While I agree that this silence could largely be attributed to cowardice, I wouldn't blame priests if they were omitting mentions of the subject because there were so many young children at church. My 11-year-old niece is innocent of any knowledge regarding the trans pervasiveness. She goes to my church, and I would feel inclined to take her outside if the sermon were about those issues in order to preserve her childhood innocence for as long as possible. Does the presence of young children seem to you like a reasonable justification for keeping the topic out of church? Do you think the topic should be proactively brought up to kids at a certain age to prepare them? My instinct is that the longer it can possibly be avoided, the better. Thank you, and SBG for life.
Well, I would say a couple of things. I understand that it's a difficulty dealing with this topic, dealing with abortion. I mean, these are really difficult topics. There are ways to talk about them that would not be appropriate for kids. You have to decide at what age you want to expose your kids to these issues, and then once you do expose them to it, there's sort of different levels of exposure. So that is a difficulty that you have to navigate. I understand that. That is not a good enough excuse to get all the pastors off the hook that don't go anywhere near this subject. I don't buy that. I think Mary's being very generous. You know, I don't buy that their primary concern is, well, it's not appropriate for kids. Because if that was the issue, then, I mean, at a minimum, there are things you can do, even if you're not speaking about it from the pulpit. There are ways you can engage on issues like this outside of speaking about it from the pulpit. You could have, at least have groups in the church where you talk about these things. You could give talks that are for adults. You could at least do that. Most of these churches don't even do that. I think that it's just not an acceptable option, I would say, as a church to completely ignore the issues that your congregation live in every day. They live with these issues every day. It plagues them. They're worried about it. They're coming to church. You know, they're sort of battered and broken out on the battlefield of the culture every single day, and they come to church on Sunday, and you need to speak to use a leftist phrase, you have to speak to their lived experience. And to just ignore it like it doesn't exist is not right. It's not helpful. I mean, this is what your film, right, and so many of your other films, you're dealing with difficult topics. There's a way that you could talk about it that would not be appropriate for kids, but you find ways to talk about it that can speak to an entire family.
Yeah, I agree with you. If this mom has a moral conviction that she wants to protect her children from difficult, bad, twisted, perverted, polluted ideas, then my question for her is, are you also not sending your children, that little girl, to public school? Are you also not allowing her on social media? Because if you are doing those things, then you have a double standard and you don't really care about protecting your daughter, because the popular media and culture and public education is raping the mind of your daughter daily and impregnating her with ideas that will destroy her sense of identity and moral value and everything else. So that's all. That conversation's already in her mind. So I don't know how she's clueless or has never heard of these things. Maybe your kids go to a great school, but we live in a culture now where you've got to talk to your kids about these things, because you're fooling yourself if you think that others are not talking with her about those things. They are.
Yeah, I don't know how you could get, in this culture, I don't know how you could even get to the age of 11 or 12 and not have broached a subject. I've already talked to my kids about these things.
We're past that.
Right. My first conversation with my kids about something related to this was like when they were 5 years old, because we're out in public and they see something, they see somebody walking down the street, and it confuses them. So, that's Daddy, that's a boy, but he's dressed like a girl. That's the first conversation that we now have to have. You explain it in a very in a way that connects with the child. And what I said to them was, well, this is someone there are people that are confused. There's someone who's confused. We should pray for them. But that's the first conversation. You're already talking about it. And as they get older, you need to keep that conversation going.
And what do you think about this? And I don't know exactly where I would come down on this, but I don't like the fact that those with perverted ideas are determining the time frame for my children to learn these things. So wait a minute, I really also don't like the idea of talking to my 5-year-old about these topics, because this is just developmentally, they're not ready for this. But I'm also not Amish, so I don't have, hay bales, fencing me in from the rest of the world. So what do I do, and how do I keep my kids away from this stuff as long as possible? Because I think that's a good idea. I think we should keep social media away from our kids as long as you can, but then realize that you're putting your kids together to give them away, and they're going to interact with all of this stuff eventually. And so, like you said, I want to determine the time frame and say, now is the time for us to talk about these things. But that's hard, because someone else has already kicked down the door and said, I'm talking to your kids about it now.
Yeah, that's exactly right. If you want to join my exclusive fan base, or a cult, that's what it is, we're forming a cult, then all you gotta do is click the subscribe button and ring the bell below this video to stay up to date with all of my content. And if you want even more, you can watch or listen to my show at thedailywire.com, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Looking forward to welcoming you to the Sweet Baby Gang.